Okay, let's get to our second lecture. This is from that book chapter, so the assigned reading doesn't show up on your schedule or on your outline until right after this lecture, but it's a section of chapter 10 from this book called Food Policy by Park Wild. And this lecture I'm just going to talk about some other parts of that chapter that I didn't think you should have to read. But if you see something interesting here, want to talk about it, or want to know more about it, you're certainly welcome to look around the chapter. The chapter does start out sort of with the idea of what is the debate around food insecurity and what are the right policy approaches to it. And of course, anytime there's sort of debate, it can move all the way back to, are we even measuring and defining things correctly? Because if we're not, then whatever the policy advice that follows is not going to be very good because we mismeasured at the start. And then, of course, if you can get everyone to agree on a set of facts about sort of food insecurity or hunger or whatever, then you might move forward and have the debate about the policy. What's the right approach? What are the right sort of mechanisms? And so they sort of kick the chapter off with that, and it frames everything. And you can read this snippet here, but I've highlighted a few things. So 14.5%, we've seen that number. Food insecure, that is the total. And then this chapter seems to go into that 1/3 of that group being hungry, sort of the low food insecurity definition, or very low, sorry. And so, the definition gets a little cloudy here, but that number we see sort of track to what we've already looked at in the USDA and Congressional Research Service data. The definition here is what goes off, because we expect to see 15% and then about 1/3 of that to be the very low food insecurity, but they're calling it hunger here. And that can be a problem as it is. The start of the chapter, though, goes into basically Feeding America, the group that basically works on U.S. food banks, sort of the national group, sort of tracks this, and of course is a big player in policy, and they also get government assistance, but also not from just the federal government, but from all sorts of municipalities and so forth, churches, other organizations. But they basically make the argument America has a lot of food. We know there's enough food. We make way more than we need. We make it and sell it around the world. But 1 in 6 Americans, hunger is a reality. So millions of Americans are struggling with hunger. And then if you move down here, and so that is Feeding America, right? I mean, an advocacy group for we got to get food to people. And these numbers, should be zero, I guess would be their position. I mean, that's certainly their efforts geared towards that. The Heritage Foundation, I guess, is a think tank, and it would be classified as conservative. I mean, I think they would classify themselves as conservative. They look at the same sort of data and say, well, actually, hunger's not prevalent. It's not 1 in 6. It is, they basically say USDA clearly is not talking about hunger when they talk about the 15 of the 1 in 6. They're saying that's food insecure. And many of these households did not cut back on intake, and we already saw that. We saw that a lot of what happens for food insecure households is they continue to sort of meet gross intake levels, but they have to change behavior and maybe choose less balance, less sort of nutritional quality in their diet. And so basically, Heritage Foundation is saying that's an appropriate economic response. They're managing this. Let's not count them in the hunger because that inflates the number by 3 times what it should be. So these are the disputes. These are the things. And it means that you can't work from odd definitions. You can't work from your own definitions, struggling with hunger, when we've already seen the USDA or Congressional Research Service, the federal government number really goes with food insecure and very low food insecurity. And if you start saying hunger because it tracks better then you're wide open to a counter of you're not using the right definition. You're inflating the number because the hungry number is 4.4%. Working from the same set of facts, two very different takes. And that's what is always of concern. So definitions, where do you get the definitions? How do you use those to collect data? Can you identify the severity, right? That's another problem here is, USDA is counting both of these as food insecure. One is more severe than the other. And then what is the correct policy approach? Here are those definitions. So beginning the 80s and 90s, so really when we start seeing this tracking of data and tracking of status and collection of data in those surveys from the consumer surveys, current population surveys. So food security is sort of the good category. Food insecurity is the problematic or the policy address category, where you're looking at, can people get the food they need, and is it adequate, right? And of course now you've got a new definition that you'd have to come up with that isn't here, but we will see, and sort of what is adequate. And then hunger basically had an initial definition, and here you can see, if you read through this, basically saying that hunger is the severe case, recurrent involuntary lack of food. It's something we don't associate with U.S. policy problems very much, because it is more sporadic. And then, of course, the word hunger, kind of gets referred to more as this individual experience, and it's not this sort of target for policy. Okay, so how do you collect this stuff? How do you, if you need to understand how to measure something, where do they get the information from? Well, surveys. So the U.S. puts out surveys all the time. The federal government puts out surveys all the time. They're putting out a census right now, but much more frequently they do something called the Current Population Survey, and certain households that participate in that over time will get extra questions, and some of those will be on the food security supplement. So this is a supplemental survey given to parts of the population at any time, or parts of the respondents in a survey, basically asking them, how would you sort of respond to these questions? We are worried about our food would run out. The food we bought didn't last. We couldn't afford to eat balanced meals. And I mentioned the third one because I know it's one of your quiz questions, but it's 15%. Basically, we couldn't afford to eat balanced meals. That's that response in the food insecure category. So they were probably meeting the intake requirement to not be hungry, to not be severe, in severe distress nutritionally, but they're also not meeting their targets for nutrition, which the Farm Bill, the food spending assistance programs have nutritional components. They are supposed to not just keep you consuming enough calories, but also try to provide sort of a healthy mix. Because there's a lot of money goes into USDA and government policy on identifying nutritional quality and recommendations on how people should consume. And so this when the data comes out, is not just these survey responses. Income and spending surveys get used as well to try to find out where the benchmarks or the thresholds are on nutrition, as well as some economic models, and we'll see one of those. So what is policy around food insecurity? Well, it's not been, a lot of it is in the Farm Bill. A lot of it is sort of SNAP or food assistance for low-income households. Part of the reason that people would be concerned is we've spent more money, or tried to make policy effort, and not made much of a dent in the problem. So in 1995, there was something called the Healthy People Initiative had a 2010 target to get food insecurity, cut it in half from 12% down to 6%. We already said in the 90s is when we sort of formalized the definitions that we kept using going forward, and you see that some initial success here, and then essentially just flat, right? Sort of hit this barrier. So whatever we're doing in policy terms, not making much effect, right? So the gap between where the target says we should be moving to and where we are actually measuring food insecurity is growing. So, on the one hand, you have people that debate and say the way we measure food insecurity is off. Other people might say the target is not achievable. And other people would say we're measuring this fine. The target is achievable. We are not getting the policy right. And then, of course, you see the food insecurity spike as we hit this 2007, 2008, 2009 recession and then flatten out. Again, we've seen the numbers from that point on. So, as a policy objective on the food insecurity side, you can see why it's a persistent sort of debate because we're moving farther from something that 25 years ago people in government said we should hit. Not 6%, but now 15%. So 25% increase when we were looking for a 50% reduction. Okay, so we said some other things go into this, and you can think about what is food insecurity. Is it okay if someone just gets enough calories? Well, government has weighed in on this as well. There's policy around sort of what the recommended consumption would be, and for years now they have been doing something called the Thrifty Food Plan. This is analysis done of what is available for people to purchase, what are the prices that people can purchase at, and what do we expect people to be able to live on per day, right? What is the sort of food cost on a per day basis? And so over here you have the target range. Basically, they're setting a target of $3.89 a day, and then some. This is my pyramid. I'm not even sure if that's if that's what it used to be, the food pyramid. Now but whatever the sort of nutritional guidelines of USDA are, that's what this is. And so these are servings of milk, meat, grains, fruit, vegetables, etc. So these are the nutritional targets. And this right here, this green column, the second column, is what people show up as eating when they take data from food diaries, right? So they ask people to record what you consume every day. And so basically, they're setting a target for the Thrifty Food Plan. This is sort of the efficient, lowest cost way of meeting all the dietary requirements in this column, and then comparing it to what people say they consume. So they consume about $1.50 more, right? So something like 40% more of the cost. And on the serving side, not quite as much milk and fruits and vegetables and certainly not in the target of fat. And so you already end up with this behavior, right, just out of the population that is quite different than the target range. But one of the goals, and I'm not going to talk about the model here, but the model basically looks to say, what would it be like, what are the sort of recommended servings we would give someone on a Thrifty Food Plan that had to meet a $3.89, and how different? So this one row right here, it says the distance function. That's just a measure of how much behavioral change you'd have to sort of get people to take on. So 6 is a huge number here. 0.09 is a very small one in this column, and that's just meeting the cost constraint and letting people continue to not hit the milk target and so forth. But this one's the official TFP, and the quiz question I'm pretty sure is going to ask you to think about $3.89 being the target spending per day per person. But you see they hit almost all of the targets here, and this is an economics model, right? This is an economics model to say we want to hit these targets, we want to make people deviate from what they're currently doing as little as possible, and this is what comes up as the recommendation. And so when you see people talking on the information and education side of nutrition to low-income households, this is the kind of thing they're going to tell them. You should be looking at your grocery spending and trying to make it match up to this so that you're getting these servings, and that will keep you sort of meeting what we would consider the threshold for income, or best use of income to meet sort of food security guidelines. Okay, and of course there's policy involved here. The dairy industry wants the Thrifty Food Plan to be sure that there's not less than 3 servings. They don't want the current average. They don't want this column. They want people to hit the recommended amount. Same thing for fruits, right? So they don't want this to be, they don't want people getting thrifty, eating the Thrifty Food Plan. They don't want people changing behavior at the expense of their good, right, of their item. And so this idea that you're going to meet cost constraints for nutrition by cutting back on milk or cutting back on fruits, is not good for those industries. And so that's why we end up with this sort of official one that matches all these requirements. Last slide here. And it's an interesting section of the chapter, and I think you're reading this, so you'll read through it as well, but I do want to highlight it. And it gets to sort of this broader policy debate. So you got 3 big things that track in the economy, and they all move together. So these are sort of co-trend items, right? If you think about a trend at any point through here, the level's different, but the slope right here is the same roughly as here and as here. And when it's turning down here, it's turning down here, and it's turning down here. So the unemployment line doesn't follow as well. But these two track quite a bit, and it makes sense because SNAP participation is really dependent on where you are relative to the poverty level. Okay, so what do we end up with here? If we look at this, we say we have the most, just tracking millions of people, high number in poverty, less than that are participating in the SNAP program, and then way less than that are unemployed. Okay, and that just tracks everywhere through here. And that's of interest because you don't have to be at the poverty line or below to get SNAP benefits. So there's a bunch of eligible SNAP participation here that is not getting in the program. Okay, and then of course the second measure down here is you would think that unemployment would be much more related to poverty in terms of level than it is, and in fact it isn't. So this is sort of this policy conundrum that we have. We have more poverty than we do people on food assistance, and then the unemployment level is much below the people that are getting participation in SNAP and in poverty. So, part of it's definitional. You can be employed and participate in SNAP. Of course you can. That's usually a condition we might call underemployment, someone earning less than they should. Wages where they live are just not high enough, and they are not able to take on enough job, a second job or enough hours in the current job to earn enough to stay out of SNAP participation, and so that's supplemental to that. And of course, there's a big gap in unemployment that we don't measure, and that's people that stop looking for work. And so policy critics would say, well, unemployment stays low, and it stays low because SNAP participation is so much higher that people don't need to look for a job. And that sort of led to some of this debate. So people fall out of the unemployment roll, I mean by that the ledger, right, the list of unemployment, because they stop looking for a job. And one of the reasons they can stop looking for a job is because they can get their food assistance needs met through SNAP. And that's the debate, right? And that's the debate about whether you should be actively seeking employment before as a qualifier for SNAP participation. If your participation in SNAP should be limited, if you're not either employed or if you're not trying to train and gain skill to get back in the employment side. And yeah, I mean, it doesn't change the fact that if you're unemployed but not seeking employment, you still can be food insecure, right? So the SNAP participation, or the SNAP program in its design, is about alleviating hunger. And sort of the policy argument that has developed over the last few years and has sort of taken hold is, well, let's use SNAP to try to close this gap and get people back into seeking employment. Of course, that has its own drawbacks. Politicians like low unemployment numbers, so they like to quickly drop people off of the category seeking employment, right? So just like people don't like large numbers in poverty in their state or their county or wherever they're presiding, they also don't like high unemployment numbers, so they try to engineer ways to get people off of the count of unemployed. So again, another set of trends that we saw spiking headed into 2010. We may see something just like this coming up. I mean, we have drastic unemployment numbers over the last few weeks, but it's not clear what those are going to be when things resume, when economic activity resumes as normal. Certainly, there's going to be some follow-on effects, but the sort of claims on unemployment spiking right now, a lot of that's just because people had to be furloughed because there was nothing to do. So we'll see how all of that goes, but that's sort of the crux of this, and that'll be the sort of end of our second lecture here. If I can get